Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Let me repeat an oft-repeated phrases in the last couple of years. Let me share my screen. Okay. So I'm actually going to start by diving in straight with a poll. So if we could get that first poll up. I just want to get a bit of a sense of why you came here today. Is it related to your work? Are you just curious? Are you just hoping for some really great pictures of penguins? And I'll let that go for a little while and while I keep talking. But I will be talking to you today about how ship traffic is connecting Antarctica to the rest of the world, and with those ships can bring the risk of introducing non-native species. So this is work that I've been doing at the University of Cambridge and the British Antarctic Survey, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about another initiative called Polar Alien Hunters. So, it's exciting seeing the polls come in. Yeah, so we've got people working in policy management, a few researchers, a few curious people. It's probably a good thing that none of you are really here for pictures of penguins, because there aren't many in my work. So thanks very much for answering that. So as I mentioned, I am also a polar alien hunter when I wear that hat, and I will take you through some of my work. And some of you might not know much about Antarctica at all, so I'll make sure we're clear on some facts about Antarctica, and I'll talk about the situation of non-native species in Antarctica at the moment, the risks they pose, and also importantly what this is connected to climate change. And I'll talk about some of my work and also look at what things we can do as individuals or as managers or as researchers in this field in the future. So first of all, just a little intro to polar alien hunters. And for this one, so for polar alien hunters, it started pretty much with the desire to help conserve Antarctic biodiversity, but through enabling people to take on biosecurity regardless of who they are, and to adopt those measures that will help protect Antarctica from invasive species. So at the moment, we're a relatively small group of researchers who work on a variety of fields, and we've got some people like Jess, who is a terrestrial biologist who also works on invasive species. I'm a marine ecologist working on invasive species, and Christy, who I saw has logged in today, is a social scientist, and she studies some of the reasons why people take nature-friendly actions in relation to tourism. And we're making comics and putting together information to help people understand more about Antarctica and how they can help protect it. So we are still growing. Please do get in touch if you're interested. We have a mailing list, which, you might get something 3 times a year or something, just giving updates on what we're up to. So, and anyone can be a polar alien hunter, regardless of whether or not you work in the poles or even on invasive species, because I haven't actually been to Antarctica, but you'll see that I am definitely a polar alien hunter, and I do work on looking for polar aliens, as it may be. So that's sort of what polar alien hunters do, or who we are, sorry. But why do we do what we do? We do it because invasive species are the second biggest threat to Antarctic biodiversity after climate change. And there have been about 200 terrestrial non-native species observed, only 6 non-native marine species, and they haven't established populations. But these come in through the research stations with the tourists and the researchers and other logistics and ship's crew. And so it is one of the big threats to such a vast area with so many unique animals. And on that note, I'd like to bring up the second poll, thanks, if that's all right. And this is just to get a sense of what you know about Antarctica. Now, being a mostly Canadian audience, I think you'll probably do fairly well at this, but we'll see. I'll let you have a read through and select which ones you think are true before we move on. Aha! Excellent. You've got the ones that mix up the Arctic and the Antarctic. Perfect. In fact, you've all got it right. Some of you maybe know a lot. Anyway, so thanks for those who answered. You probably couldn't bear for me to go on without actually letting you what Weddell seals know what they really sound like. So let me just quickly play this video. I'll leave it there, but the first time I ever heard Weddell seals, I couldn't believe that it was really animals making those noises. So they are truly wonderful. I'd recommend looking them up if you get the chance. But yes, Antarctica, through the Antarctic Treaty System, is designated as a place that shall only be used for peaceful purposes. And this has been the case since it entered into force in 1961. And there are currently 54 parties to the treaty, so 54 countries that are involved. And that means that any management decisions, any governance is collectively done through these parties. And that also limits the kind of activities that people can do when they're in Antarctica. And this also limits the kind of ways that non-native species could arrive in Antarctica. So as far as human activity is concerned, peaceful activities such as tourism and science and fisheries are allowed. There's no mineral resource extraction, so there's no mining. And although there's wild capture fisheries, there's no farming or aquaculture, and in fact, it's prohibited to introduce non-native species deliberately. And this already means that Antarctica is actually quite well protected compared to some other parts of the world, because there's a limited number of ways that something could get there. Now, there are a few policy-minded people listening in, but don't worry, I won't spend forever on this. But there are quite a number of relevant bodies or organisations that are involved in managing invasive species in Antarctica one way or another. So there's IATO, which is an organisation that manages tourism. There's the Council of Managers of National Antarctic Programs that keep an eye on what some of the national operators are doing. There's the Scientific Committee for Antarctic Research, and they can provide information or advice to Antarctic Treaty parties at the meetings. And an important part of the Antarctic Treaty System is the Environment Protocol. And this is where the introduction of non-native species is prohibited, and also where some priorities for research and management are set. And in recent times, that has included creating a non-native species manual and highlighting that we actually don't know a lot about non-native species in the Antarctic region. And of course, when it comes to marine invasive species, organisations like the International Maritime Organization and their conventions are also applicable. So thinking more about invasive species, and you're all I'm sure, aware that polar bears are not found in Antarctica, and they would have a great time because penguins, in Antarctica anyway, don't have any terrestrial predators, so they would just, the polar bears would be able to come through and eat all the penguins they could without any issues there. So I would like to talk a little bit about what makes a species invasive. And so there's been a lot of discussion over the years about what terminology we should or shouldn't be using when it comes to talking about invasive species. And a lot of this is because some of the language also has other meanings in other contexts that, you know, is very serious for many people. And it means that it's actually quite difficult to talk about the concept of people deliberately or accidentally moving species from one place to another without touching on some of that language. But what I mean when I talk about invasive is that I mean a species that has been moved by people from one place to another where it perhaps couldn't get to or hasn't evolved, and in that place it has some kind of negative effect, makes some kind of change in an existing biological community, and that can have impacts on either biodiversity or human activities. And as I'm sure some of you are, or most of you are already aware of, that it's one of the top 5 threats to global biodiversity. And when we're thinking about the risks of those species coming to Antarctica, I think of it as a 5-stage process. So the first step being what we call uptake into a pathway. And in the context of my work, is an animal making a lovely home for itself on the hull of a ship that then goes to Antarctica. Whether it then survives that journey and sort of jumps ship and arrives in Antarctica is the second step, the transport and introduction phase. And then the third step means that species would actually have to reproduce and establish a population in that area. And then beyond that, they might go and have an impact and become invasive. But most of the work that I do, and really what we're still trying to find out about for Antarctica, is in these first 2 to 3 stages. So the good news is that there are no non-native species, marine species anyway, in Antarctica that we know of. So there have been no confirmed populations. There have been sort of individual sightings of 6 species that were probably introduced by ships, but they never established populations. And so these are things like mussels, great spider crabs, some bryozoans for anyone who likes marine invertebrates. They're sometimes known, they're small colonial animals that are quite in many places in the ocean, as well as tunicates and things that are related to anemones, sea anemones. And so these are the sorts of things that we might find on ships. And the process that I particularly look at is called biofouling. And so this is anything, any kind of algae, animal, even microbes that grow on the wetted surface. In my work, I'm looking at ships, but it can also be in other places on human structures. And these can be really diverse communities with things from different kingdoms, phyla, different ways of living. But most of the time, they're what we call sessile, which means that as adults, they don't move around, or they can't really move around much. So once they're stuck, they stay there. And they tend to live on a hard surface. In nature, this might be a rock, but in the case of ships, the lovely metal or metal-coated hull is what they go for. And these are all shallow water organisms because if they're growing on a ship, even if the ship goes over deep water, it's always in the top surface layer. And there are a couple of ways they can disperse. The first one is passive. So, for example, barnacle might release larvae into the water. They drift around on ocean currents for a few days or weeks, and then they land, and then that's where they turn into adults, and that's where they stay. Some other organisms are brooders, and that means that their young don't actually go too far away from them. But it means that the kinds of species that could be introduced on ships would have to cross an ocean to get to Antarctica, because Antarctica is quite isolated. I'm here to tell you that it's more connected than we thought, but even so, it is quite isolated. So there are ocean currents that circle around the continent. It's geographically isolated, it's a long distance from any other landmass. And for shallow water species, it means that it's also a long way from any other shallow coastal areas where they might naturally live. And thinking about that third step of the invasion pathway, anything that could arrive in Antarctica is has to be able to survive the very cold conditions. So the water is -1.8 to about 3 degrees Celsius. And in some places it doesn't really go above 1. And there's a lot of ice. Sometimes Antarctica does live up to expectations. It's very cold and it's very icy. So there are no parts of the coastline that are free of ice all year round. So anything that could get there must be able to survive. And so this map really just reinforces that Antarctica is disconnected from other continents, and the ocean currents, some of them go above the subantarctic islands. The Antarctic convergence is one of those, and some of them stay below them, and the grey line there is 60 degrees south, and everything below that falls under the Antarctic Treaty System. And so thinking about, well, if I were a barnacle or a mussel living in South America, would it be possible for me to get to Antarctica under my own steam? And so some researchers a little while ago looked into this, and they modelled releasing particles from subantarctic islands. In this picture it's South Georgia, and they found that less than 0.2% of particles released from all subantarctic islands reached the continent of Antarctica. And most of those did that within 3 years, and the fastest one took the best part of a year. So if we're thinking back to those larval dispersing barnacles or mussels, they need days to weeks to find somewhere to settle. So that's far too long for those sorts of organisms. And so the only way that they might be able to make it would be rafting on kelp communities. So, and storms also help wash some of these kelp rafts or particles to the continent. And so kelp rafts, they are obviously a way of transporting seaweed, but they can also transport anything growing in amongst them. So here, a few years ago, some researchers found that there were these bryozoans, which are actually in picture D there, and also some barnacles that were alive in Antarctica on these kelp rafts. So it's sort of an inkling that these physiological barriers of the temperature might actually be not as much of a barrier as we initially thought. And of course, human activity can transport these non-native species across the physical barriers. So a ship is able to cross that stretch of ocean in a matter of days that would have taken years, perhaps, going on ocean currents. And human activity, of course, is also altering the climate. So by the end of the century, there will be more ice-free habitat in coastal areas and a warmer seabed, potentially opening the door for species that need a little bit warmer temperatures and don't tolerate ice so well. And this is particularly true for the Antarctic Peninsula. And you may have seen headlines about record temperatures in Antarctica, or even icebergs calving. These are a couple of years old now, but Antarctica is one of the fastest changing areas in the world, especially this part of the Antarctic Peninsula. And this change in ice may also lead us to a change in habitat. So some other work that was done almost 10 years ago now actually found that in areas that are ice-free less than 40% of the time, so for over 60% of the year, they have sea ice sitting at the surface of the water, and that actually stops light, or some light anyway, getting through. And that means that over the course of the year, there's not enough light for large seaweeds and macroalgae to grow. And that means we see these sort of classic Antarctic seabed communities that have these really big sponges and worms, and there are, in that picture, there are limpets and starfish and sea cucumbers and all kinds of these amazing things that just grow really big in Antarctica. And you get these kind of really animal-dominated communities. But once that threshold changes, and in fact these areas are ice-free for more than 40% of the time, suddenly there's enough light over the course of the year for seaweeds to grow. So we see a shift from these communities dominated by animals to communities dominated by seaweeds and algae. And that means that if I am a species from maybe South America or South Africa or Southern Australia, where there are, you know, lots of seaweeds, and I need these to survive, now there's that biological community that I need in Antarctica as well. So human activity through climate change is also lowering these physiological barriers that had previously kept Antarctica safe from invasive species. So what I want you to take from this before we kind of move on to more about human activity and shipping is that natural dispersal to Antarctica is possible for these sorts of organisms, but it's very limited. We have changes in the physical Antarctic environment, especially in the Antarctic Peninsula, due to climate change. And this might even be changing the biological environment there. So what do we know about human activity? We know it is increasing and has done over the last few decades. So there are some really, tourism has been tracked really well, but it's not only in tourism that we're seeing these increases. And some estimates I made a few years ago were that there are probably about 180 ships visiting per year on about 500 voyages. And this might not be a lot compared to the, almost 100,000 vessels in the global fleet, but this is important for a region that has no other connection apart from whales, let's say, going in and out to the rest of the world. And also, human activities aren't all the same. So whether it's tourism, fishing, research, resupply, they are active at different times of years, and they may also visit different places. So we might need to consider their introduction risk for non-native species separately. But let's get back to ships. So as I've said, ships facilitate this dispersal across the ocean currents, and ships are also necessary for any of the activities that we do in Antarctica. Even though people can fly in and out of Antarctica, the runways and the stations that they might fly in and out of are still supplied and supported by ships. And so knowing that ships can have all kinds of organisms growing on them, I've been really interested in trying to understand where the ships come from. So anywhere that a ship spends time, it has the potential to be gathering species on its hull. And so if a ship spends a lot of time somewhere outside Antarctica, then they are the species there that they might bring to Antarctica. And I'm also interested in what routes ships take to get to Antarctica, because this can tell us something about step 2 of the invasion pathway, about survival perhaps. And it also has important implications for management if it's suitable to have safety inspections or something similar before ships actually go to Antarctica. And then one of the big questions as well is, where do they go when they get to Antarctica? Because this is where they could be introducing species to. And then there's also the question of whether or not different activities have different introduction risks. And so this network of ship traffic has some answers. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about how I created the network, but some of you might have been keeping tabs on the Ever Given ship last year or the year before when it became trapped in the Suez Canal. And at that time, there were loads and loads of these websites with maritime intelligence data popping up in the news. And you could go and click on them and you could see all the ships all around the world and where they were going. And so I got data from one of those companies and I said, I just want to look at the ships that have visited Antarctica over a 5-year period. And I took where all the ports they'd been to everywhere else in the world and combined it with some locations that I generated in Antarctica, because there are no ports in Antarctica. And I used that to create a ship traffic network. And this is what I found. I found that ships that visit Antarctica travel from everywhere in the world. Every little dot you see is a port that was visited by a ship that also visited Antarctica. And therefore, every little dot is a potential source location for non-native species visiting Antarctica. And yes, most activity, also there were some really important ports in South America, but there's also a lot of visits to places in Northern Europe and also in the Northwest Pacific. And these are the areas where ships collectively spend the most time when they're not in Antarctica. So there's a good chance that most of the biofouling organisms on these ships is actually from these locations. We don't know that for sure, but at least we know now where we could start looking. And there's clearly a strong connection from the European Arctic through Europe, Northern Europe, to South America via the Atlantic. And that's a pathway I think that I'm really interested in looking into a bit more. And I also looked at the different routes that ships can take to get there. So I found that actually there were 58 ports that had direct connections to Antarctica and were a last port of call for a voyage that went to Antarctica. And traditionally, we've thought of gateway cities, recognized gateway cities, as the main places that ships visit before going to Antarctica. And these recognized gateway cities are cultural and logistical hubs for Antarctic research and tourism, and were often traditionally the departure ports for Antarctic exploration, 100 years ago or longer. And these ports are Ushuaia in Argentina, Punta Arenas in Chile, Lyttelton or Christchurch in New Zealand, Hobart in Australia, and Cape Town in South Africa. And these are still important ports. Most ships do visit, and most voyagers do visit those ports before going to Antarctica. However, if we are going to attempt to introduce biosecurity measures or screening, whether that's for terrestrial or marine species, or even have safety inspections for vessels before they go to Antarctica, I think we need to be aware that if we focus on those 5 ports, or even extending it to 6 if we include Stanley in the Falkland Islands or Islas Malvinas, then we will actually miss a lot of the voyages to Antarctica. But what about areas in Antarctica where we might be introducing species to. And this is really important if we want to have any hope of detecting them. Antarctica is vast. It is such a huge area, and we don't have any, there are no cities of people, there are no, populations of people living there all the time who might be able to see things for us. So the only way we're going to notice any invasive species really is if we look for them. And what I found was that the Antarctic Peninsula and the South Shetland Islands, which are a small set of islands just to the north of the Antarctic Peninsula, receive orders of magnitude more visits from ships than the rest of Antarctica. And this is really important if you remember that the Antarctic Peninsula and that area is also the part of Antarctica that's changing fastest with climate change. And I identified 20 of the top high-risk locations, and 18 of those were in the South Shetland Islands and in the Antarctic Peninsula. And in particular, this area just near Anvers Island, where there are quite a few research stations and also many popular tourist landing sites. So I think we're in a much better position than we were beforehand, because at least we now know where to look. Looking might be difficult, but we have a much better idea of where we might be introducing things to in Antarctica. And I also wanted to mention that, or remind you that the different activity types have different seasonal activity, but they also have a different spatial activity. So while tourist ships tend to visit the Antarctic Peninsula and stop off at a few places and then return, research vessels, they actually connect the whole continent. So there are connections with every region within Antarctica through research vessels. There are some places that are only really visited by supply or research vessels or fishing vessels, and then there are some places where it's a fairly balanced mix. And so that means that for any location around Antarctica, we might need to think about the approach to managing the risk of introducing species a little differently depending on whether it's being visited mostly by researchers, mostly by tourists, or mostly by fishing vessels. And so where does that leave us? I've talked a lot already about Antarctica and how things might get there and the ways and the paths they might use to take. But I think one of the great things about this topic is that actually it's an emerging issue. There are no records of non-native marine species in Antarctica that we know of as established populations, which means we still have time to do something about it. And this is the last region of the world that is free of marine invasive species. And so I think we have an amazing opportunity to do something about that. But Antarctica is more connected than we thought. Ships from so different industries visit all parts of the world. And there are 54 countries that are party to the Antarctic Treaty. And so tackling this topic will require a combined effort from all industries and nations, because anyone who visits has a role to play. And it's the combination of ship activity and climate change that are really increasing the risk to Antarctica, because Antarctica has been protected by physical and physiological barriers that by ship activity and climate change are being lowered. And it means that to protect Antarctic ecosystems, we actually do need to address these multiple pressures. And the fact that both of these are more intense around the Antarctic Peninsula is in some ways a concern for the Antarctic Peninsula, but it also may allow us to identify key areas and prioritize actions there. So I think there's something certainly useful and positive we can take from that. But then what can actually we do about this? So as individuals, and this is true whether you're visiting Antarctica or any other area really, we can clean our clothes and equipment, make sure we're not taking any sneaky beasties with us, or seeds as well, if you're looking at terrestrial invasive species. And this can be things like making sure we vacuum our pockets and our zippers before we go anywhere. And this is something that really does help. And I think something we can also do is adopt what I think of as a biosecurity mindset. So we can be aware that if we have mud on our shoes, there might be something in there, or be aware that our clothes might have seeds stuck to them, or that our, dive gear might need to be dried out and cleaned before we take it somewhere else. And so knowing these risks, we can follow guidelines when they're in place. And for Antarctica, because climate change is such a threat, we can actually encourage our governments to take action on climate change, and that will help address the issue of invasive species. But of course, it's not only up to individuals. And so for researchers, I think some outstanding questions and things that I would really like to see addressed, and maybe I'll look at in my future work, is that I want to know what species are really on these ships, what might be coming to Antarctica, because very few studies have actually looked at what is growing on the ships of hulls that visit Antarctica. There's a wealth of knowledge for other parts of the world, but because the ships pass through such cold water, it's a bit of a mystery about what can actually grow on these ships. And I also want to know where the organisms like mussels that are growing on ships, where do they come from? Because mussels, for example, are found everywhere, pretty much. So did the ship collect the mussels when they were in Europe? Or if the ship visited Greenland, where I know there are also some mussels that are like the cold water, did the ship pick up the mussels there? Or are they South American mussels? Because that might make a difference to whether or not those mussels can actually survive in Antarctica. And so then I'm also really interested in knowing what are the physiological things limiting invasive species surviving in Antarctica. So if we know we have mussels or barnacles growing on a ship, will those mussels survive in Antarctica now? Probably not, but maybe we should test that. And will they survive in the future? Because we know climate change is happening. And so I'm interested in finding out more about whether or not these physical and physiological barriers that have essentially protected Antarctica for millions of years, whether they will continue to protect Antarctica given the changes of human activity and climate change. And for managers, I think the key thing is that we need to work across multiple groups and industries that are active across all Antarctic regions. It's everyone's responsibility to ensure that they're not introducing non-native species. And parties that have signed up to the Antarctic Treaty have agreed that they won't introduce non-native species. So this is something that we can work on together. And there are examples in other parts of the world where biosecurity or management practices for biofouling or other pathways and vectors for marine invasive species have been implemented. And that's not to say that they will necessarily be applicable or feasible in Antarctica, but we can look to those areas and think about what might or might not be possible. So thanks so much for listening. I'll happily take any questions that you've got. I can see a couple have already popped up on the Q&A. I'm sort of in between positions at the moment, but please do get in touch. I've got my details there. Thank you very much for listening.